All right, so we already done Gilded Age, the first section. Next one hit America in Transition. I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly. This is an interesting section because it's not all about the cities, not all about the rural areas, but it does cover a little bit of both. So it's kind of in between. So in transition is a pretty good title for it, right? So simply put, we're gonna see an increase in urbanization. And that just means cities are growing. And that word urban means city, urbanization, growth of cities, mainly because of factories and immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, but also other factors. In rural areas, things are changing. 40% of Americans will live in cities by 1900. By 1920, in that US census, most Americans will live in cities. So we're getting to that point where America's shifting from agriculture to industry, making that change, if you will. That's often why history classes, US history classes are divided up at this time point. But nonetheless, one of the reasons that's pushing for agriculture change is innovation. That's one thing people always argued, oh, slavery had to be necessary. I would make the argument that once we get rid of slavery, we see technology and innovation take off where we need less workers. A perfect example really is Cypress McCormick. As you can see, this is the old school way to cut down wheat, if you will. And this is his mechanical reaper, the new way. And we see the difference in time-saving techniques and labor is incredible. When you look at the left side and the right side, you think of which side requires less labor. It's this side clearly by hand. What two people to operate this machine could do more than one person in a whole day. The comparison's pretty ridiculous. I actually talk about it in my History 1301 class, a little bit more in depth, but this is one of the reasons why people are leaving rural areas. There's not jobs. And this is actually pretty common in today's modern world and even third world countries or first world countries, whatever you want to call them, is that smaller towns don't have the same job opportunities. So people move to bigger cities to find those. And it may be from small town to bigger town and find more teaching opportunities or better pay in teaching. That's just one example of what we see even in modern times. But back then, the increased urbanization isn't just immigrants and factories, it's a lack of jobs in the rural areas. So we see internal migration, if you will, in the US, not just immigration, but also internal migration. Look at this map, let's take a look at this map and you'll see that the darker areas clearly mean that there's more people in those areas. If a city had over 100,000, it had a black dot on it to make it on the map. And from here on in 1880, you can see it's mainly in northeast of the United States, which makes sense if people come from Europe, coming in as immigrants. Immigrants aren't gonna have the money to make it here, then travel across the country, because that's gonna cost money, then get land and start farming in this area. People aren't gonna do that in large numbers at all. If you're an immigrant, you're barely getting here, so looking for better opportunities. You're gonna come in, find a quick job, maybe align yourself with the people with the same culture, similar culture, same areas, which we'll talk about that in a second. And that's why we see this area populated more. Just like throughout human history, human civilization, cities will be built along waterways. That's going to start changing a little bit. Now on the other side, we do have California, very populated, and that's from immigration as well, but not from Europe, from Asia, which is a whole other story on itself that we could talk about. Now there are lots of people that have gone to California. When we look at the California Gold Rush of 48, creating the 49ers and so forth, there is a huge increase there, but in 1880, we're still seeing both sides connected. Now in 1920, 40 years later, see the massive difference. Again, 1880, 1920. You see much more populated states on this side. One year in our state STAAR test, that's exactly what it asked. It had these states highlighted, and it asked what event led to increase in population in these states, something similar to that. And you gotta think what connected this side of the country to this side of the country that meant more people can move to the area and become more populated. And the answer is the Transcontinental Railroad. Plays a big role in population movements as well, which we did talk about that in the last section a bit more. Now, not all cities are because of Transcontinental Railroad. Not all cities because of industry either. When you think of Salt Lake City, Mormons play a significant role in the founding of that city. Denver and the Rocky Mountains in general, we're going to see a lot of silver discovered in that area. That's going to lead to an increase in migration population to those areas. Dallas and Houston. Dallas is going to be the Transcontinental Railroad is actually going to run to Dallas. I'll talk about that towards the end of this section, as a matter of fact, and plays a significant role. Houston as a port becomes very important even today with 2 million people in Houston alone. So you can just see the difference. Industry does play a big role. It's not all near waterways. It's not all industry for its populated areas, but it does play a big role when you think of those northern cities and northern factories. You see that quite a bit. And of course, not until the later part of 1900s do we see migration increase from Latin America instead of Europe and Asia. And that's when, if you look at modern times, the most populated cities are actually in the South. But 100 years ago, we're looking at a different story altogether, just to give you a clear idea. One of the problems dealing with these urban areas are tenements. I always tell my students to circle the word tenements and write tiny apartments, because these places are so small. They're looking at one bedroom such as this, right? And you have family or maybe multiple families living in that one bedroom. These are tiny little rooms in these buildings called tenements. Unsafe conditions. There's no ventilation. So when it got hot in the summertime, people died. When there's no indoor plumbing, you get a bucket, throw it outside. If you have a window, if you don't have a window, because a lot of them didn't have windows, you gotta take it down and dump it out in the street, like you can see here in this picture. Many didn't have windows. There's no government rules, regulations, so they don't have fire escapes. They don't have fire alarms. They don't have a plan at all. Some of them might have small stairs. It's pretty bad without the regulations of a city government or city council or anything like that. So it's actually pretty bad. Bad public service. If you take a look at this picture here, there's a dead horse in the street. There's no government regulations saying you can't have livestock in the city. There's no government agencies or public services like garbage man to remove. Even New York has one of the earliest ones. It's nowhere near at that level. There's no government rules, regulations saying kids need to be in school. Instead they're out in the streets where people have thrown their crap and poop, human waste essentially, from the tenements, and you have dead animals. It's not safe conditions. And this idea of tenements and the way life exists in these bigger cities is why we call it the Gilded Age. Because the whole time we're talking about how great industry is, how many jobs, money, innovations, but when we look at the daily life, it's pretty bad. From overcrowding to disease running rampant to children in the streets and child labor, if not in the streets, and child labor working in factories. This is why we call it the Gilded Age, is the exact reason. Now, there are some people that want to show how bad it is. One man is Jacob Reese. He's a photographer, he's an immigrant himself. He knows how bad this is, and he wants to show people how bad. So he's going to take pictures. He's going to use some new flash photography for nighttime pictures and take pictures such as this one and this one. And even in poor alleyways, poor conditions of the tenements. And he takes it to the local papers and he says, here you go, we gotta run this and show people how it is. And the editors say, no, we can't. You have baby coffins. The infant mortality rate is really, really bad. We can't have baby coffins on the cover of our newspapers. Nobody's going to buy them, nobody. So he takes it upon himself to essentially what we would call a slideshow. He has a slideshow and he knows wealthy people, his connections through the stock market, which he lost money on. And as a journalist, he calls wealthy people in and he has a slideshow room for them, and he presents to them these pictures, and he explains, this is how the other half lives. And then he'll explain every neighborhood, how 9 people died last year alone, 5 carried out in baby coffins. And he goes on and on, and it really touches them. And this is what's interesting about this, is that within years, New York City would start invoking codes like a fire escape, indoor plumbing. These tenement buildings were torn down. Landlords have rules that they have to follow now. What's interesting about it is that you would think it's the poor people who are suffering from these conditions that would have to rise up, but it's not. It's actually wealthy people who take it upon themselves and say, this is wrong. We should intervene, we should do something. We have to do something. It's interesting how that works out, that somebody else has to step in for it. Now I think, why would wealthy people do this? And yeah, it's the first time they've seen it, right? They've never been to these neighborhoods, they don't know about it, so maybe it's shock and awe. But it is well known that back then at that point in time, Christians felt a need to stop this, It wasn't a sin for them to make money, it wasn't a sin for them to live comfortably, but it was wrong for them to allow this to continue. And so it was essentially religion that played a big role. Now that's different than now, because a lot of people that are wealthy and claim they're Christians, and they don't have those Christian values as people did back then. But it does play a significant role in why people go to the government. These wealthy people tell them, we're not voting for you unless you fix this. This is wrong, do something. And the local governments demand fire escapes. Indoor plumbing is a big one, really makes a big difference. But so it is wealthy people that make that difference and make that change. And Jacob Riis is one of many guys. We're talking about the next section about other people just like him and why journalists are so important. There's actually another case. Political machines, always circle that one and start. This is a difficult one that students have trouble with. Imagine a group of people that control a city. New York City is our example. And I keep using New York City as an example. There's all major cities have this problem, from Chicago to Philadelphia. They all got these same major problems. New York is just the biggest one and the best example. And they have a political machine like all these other ones. Imagine almost like city council members or a group of individuals, most of them voted into office. They have control over the city. And they run it like a fine old machine. Everything's perfectly done, but it's all pretty corrupt. For example, they take bribes, they buy votes. If I want to get votes, I would go when it's voting time, I would go to a German part of town, and everybody gets free beer. They're gonna vote for me. Some guys, we give out Boss Tweed, we got turkeys, right? Got things like that to get you to vote for them. Now that's buying the vote, and that's illegal. You can't do that. I'm sure nobody does that nowadays, right? But nonetheless, that's constant. Political machines use bribes and corruption. Even blackmail from all kinds of things to remain in power, from influencing the votes, getting people to vote by buying it, or even corruption. The perfect example I have of that is the leader of political machines were called bosses. In New York, his name is Boss Tweed. The name of the political machine in New York was called, nicknamed Tammany Hall, but Boss Tweed was the head of Tammany Hall. He's head of New York's political machine. And in one case, they decide they're going to remodel the bathroom in City Hall. And back then, it's not a huge bathroom, it's a small bathroom. And now, what you do if you need remodeling done, the taxpayer money is going to pay for the remodel of City Hall, right? But Boss Tweed could go to person A, say, okay, what bid? How much would you do this for? And they say they do it for $20,000. Okay, I go to another person. That person says, I can do the exact same work, same stuff, but it'll cost you $30,000. Now, in all reality, what I should do as city manager or city council member or treasurer, whatever my job is, I should look to the $20,000 and choose that one because it's more affordable. It's the same product, same service, and the taxpayers get a better deal. And in modern times, that's exactly what happened. In modern times, we're very transparent. And if the school district took the higher bid for no reason, somebody would find out about it, a journalist write about it, and get publicized, and it would go viral, and people would be upset about it. That's what journalists do. They uncover that stuff that we don't have time to uncover and go through, right? But back then, now everything's always made public that easy. As a matter of fact, what Boss Tweed does, he'll go to the man that offers to do it for $30,000. Hey, I tell you what, I'll do it for $30,000 for you, but you have to pay me $2,000. That guy's going to do it. He'll pay you $2,000. He'll make $28,000 now. I make an extra $2K. I'm Boss Tweed. I make the extra money. He makes the extra money. We don't care. We're not hurt. I'm not spending my money. I'm spending the taxpayer money. So keep that in mind. This is one perfect example of how Boss Tweed could do it and how corruption and bribes took place all the time. It was money, but it also was buying votes, as a matter of fact. Boss Tweed, his downfall actually is from a journalist. Not written journalism at all. People did write about him and say, hey, this is what he's doing, this is what he's doing. Boss Tweed wasn't worried. Remember, most people coming from New York are from Eastern or Southern Europe or other parts of Europe that they can't read English. So they come, you can write whatever you want about Boss Tweed, but they can't read it in newspapers. But one guy, Thomas Nass, this journalist, takes it upon himself and starts drawing cartoons. So you see Boss Tweed with a money sack for a head. Okay? Now, people who don't read English see this like, why is this Boss Tweed? Like, what does this mean? What's going on? Why are you drawing him like this? He's a nice guy. And somebody could explain what's going on. And they have cartoons like this. There's Boss Tweed in charge. It says the ballot. And it says, in counting, there is strength. And that's what's the matter. So it's words, but I see something's up and I ask somebody real quick, and that's very simple for them to explain. And his words start spreading. Boss Tweed eventually is in a lot of trouble. Famous quote from Boss Tweed: "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care what papers write about me. My constituents can't read, but damn it, they can see the pictures." And it eventually comes down and bites Boss Tweed in the rear, because he will get the attention through political cartoons and what actually works for him. He'll get arrested and thrown in jail for corruption and bribery. He does try to escape. He bribes his way out and gets to Spain, and they extradite him back. But that's what most people do. You bribe your way out of stuff for a little bit. There's a pretty interesting drunk history. It's not super accurate, but it's entertaining for the very least. You can take that out. You can actually search for YouTube if you want to. But nonetheless, political machines, it's one of the toughest subjects for students to be able to deal with. Now, if you have me for class, we've gone over push factors and pull factors of immigration. It's pretty self-explanatory. Push factor is something that pushes you away. War, disease, famine, bad economy. Pull factor is something that pulls you in. Good economy, jobs, money, safety, freedoms, right? We've talked about that quite a bit before. In America, we're used to so many pull factors. We don't see a lot of push factors. In America, one push factor might be healthcare, especially if you live near the border, northern border. You might actually be enticed to move over to the Canadian border to get that better healthcare. But other than that, we have a lot of pull factors in America, right? Now, that's what brings a lot of people to America in the past 100 years or so. But 100 years ago, we had these new immigrants coming over from South and Eastern Europe. I always tell my kids these two things. I always tell them circle new immigrants and make sure you have an arrow going to Southern and Eastern Europe because you have to know where they're from. And when we think about last semester, pre-Civil War, the first people faced discrimination is actually the Irish. And one of the reasons was because the Irish were Catholic. The Protestant Americans, predominant Protestant Americans, did not like the Irish. They're Catholic, amongst other reasons as well. And it's no different from those Southern immigrants. Those Southern immigrants from the most southern country in Europe, the boot one, right? Italy, they were Catholic. Vatican City is in Italy, right? So that's an issue that we see. The discrimination of new immigrants reaches a whole new level. And the differences are pretty great to prove this point. Then those that came from North or Western Europe were often Protestants. They're literate and skilled, have some sort of skills, whether it be carpentry or blacksmith or something like that. They were quick to assimilate. When you think the first 100 years of American history, these guys that came to America, they adapted, they assimilated whatever was going on in local churches. They were all Protestants, so picking Methodists or Baptists wasn't a huge ordeal or change, and they quick to adapt in society. And they usually came from democratic countries. Now that's not always the case, the thing about this, but even with Britain, when we think of that one, they had a parliament at least. Many of these had representation of some sorts. And they usually weren't completely poor. The Irish are exemptions to this case. The Irish are the exemption. But Germans, of all the ones that came over pre-Civil War, around the time of Civil War, 20% went back. So that tells you they had a decent amount of money to be able to go back. The new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia area, Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Italy, this area, like the Polish area, most of them weren't Protestants. If they weren't Catholic like Italians, they were Orthodox Christians, which were, I don't say hugely different because they all have the same Savior, Christ, there's other Christians, but they were different and confusing. And anytime anything's different and unknowing, people find it as a threat, right? They're often illiterate and unskilled. And I tell my students to think of this. You think of when you took war history before, we had the feudal peasants and stuff like that in Europe, and they grew out of that, right? Well, part of Europe didn't. When we looked at Eastern Europe, it appears that they still were like that. It's not very organized kingdoms or countries or anything like that. It's pretty poor off and pretty much no government whatsoever. These people are uneducated. They're just barely get by farming. Even their own language are probably uneducated and illiterate. But they're going to leave there with little skills, right? At peasant times, they can grow food and dig ditches. That's about it. When they do get to America, they're not going to assimilate very well and stay together. Part of that's religion. Like if I come to America, first thing, and I'm Orthodox Christian, the first thing I'm gonna look for is an Orthodox church. And if I find an Orthodox Christian in his church, I'm probably gonna have a lot to do with those people and stick with those people and stick with my clan. I'm not gonna assimilate well at all, okay? Came from undemocratic countries. When we think about these, the lives were no countries at all. But keep in mind, at this point, Karl Marx has written his manifesto. And so that has spread out, and people have argued that just that concept at all had these people in America thinking that those Eastern Europeans were very, which I guess you would say, anti-democratic and just anarchists in general. And that's a bill, so I gotta stop right now. All right, sorry about that, we're back. When we talk about these immigrants coming over, we do know that most of it is in the New York area, right? So if you come to Ellis, I see Statue of Liberty, head to Ellis Island. Down here I have a Drunk History Statue of Liberty. It's kind of a brief story of how Statue of Liberty actually got built. It was a gift from France, but to get it together, couldn't find anybody to pay for it. But it's an interesting story if you get a chance to check that out. But at Ellis Island, you wait in line, you would answer some questions, and you would be able to get in. Usually a few hour wait. Now, Europeans were much different, treated much different than their counterpart immigrants, the Asians in California. And I've actually thought about this. In modern times, it seems like we have an idea that immigration's okay from certain countries, right? Like we say that the Trump's presidency, for example, at one point, Trump's made his stance pretty clear he's anti-immigration, even though his wife is from Europe. He's made a stance that these loopholes to get citizenship through your children, it's not okay. He's against that. His wife's parents did exactly that while he was president. He's even been known for saying stuff like, why are people coming from these sleeping hold countries, meaning these Northern African countries in huge numbers. And so when we look at that, we're like, oh man, that's wrong, can't say stuff. This concept of some immigrants being okay and some not, that's been going on for about 100 years. One of those things where like, hey, history is repeating itself. It typically is when we look at that. And these people, when they came in, the new immigrants did face discrimination. The ones coming from Germany and Great Britain might have it easier, but nonetheless, they all came to New York and they settled with like-minded people, right? The Italians, we go to part of New York that we now call Little Italy, because they stayed together, spoke the same language, the same culture, same Catholic parishes and everything. They all stayed together. Even Asians who made their way across the country, or like Asians that came through Europe, would find their way to Chinatown in New York. They have certain sections for many people from much smaller than that, if you're thinking of Polish or anything like that. They didn't spread out that far, and New York was where they found home. It's often referred to as ethnic ghettos. And I always remember to mention that because like what we call a ghetto, we always think it's a negative term. It usually means a really packed neighborhood. Other countries don't use that word. They use the word slums sometimes for poor neighborhood. And so you might see that as well. Whatever you see on tests, these people do face some kind of tough conditions to get in. The Asians coming in, 90% of them being Chinese, coming to California, they faced even worse conditions. They would be stripped naked, did medical exams, kept often overnight in a jail on what we call Angel Island there on the other side. Treated entirely different than the counterparts over here in Europe. But again, that's history repeating itself, and this mentality that we have that, oh, immigrants from one place are okay, but not from over there. We even see that when we see certain bans on people coming from Muslim countries, that, oh, it's not if that person's bad, it's that the country's bad. So it's interesting to think about. Key point of this immigrants coming over was the idea that they need to assimilate. And so Americans in general really push for this idea of assimilation. I always have my kids circle these two words, a key word to know. If I'm to assimilate to a country, to a culture, it means I become more like that culture. My wife's from Mexico, so when I go to Mexico and I have to adapt to that culture, whether it's the way you speak to people. I always think that tipping is part of culture, because in some countries, tipping is very important. That it's part of the people's pay. Some cultures, it's like some areas, you tip because that's the only way they're getting paid. And in America, tipping is a weird thing. Like you can do, some people do it without doing it at all. So to me, that's part of culture. But religion is, adapts to religious. The basic standards ideas of what's polite, what's not polite. To me, traffic. If you ever drive in Mexico, it's like wherever you can fit your car in, you get in. Like there are no lines in Mexico. It feels like traffic. But that's just part of culture there, right? You try to adapt. I try to assimilate and work my way in. If I was to reference and say we need to assimilate to American culture and make the person more American, that's when we use the word Americanized. It's more specific. This is a point in time where we're going to try to Americanize immigrants. They also want to Americanize Native Americans. And so this idea to do this really comes to the best place to Americanize somebody is school. Think about it. You come to school, you say the Pledge of Allegiance. A little bit more patriotic. You come to school. In Texas, they make you say the Texas Pledge to make it up Texas. And then we have a moment of silence after that, which was really supposed to be a moment of prayer, but that's illegal. Can't force that in public schools. And so they say, no, we'll just call it a moment of silence for reflection. But I can get you more patriotic. I can get you to be more proud to be Texas. In English class, maybe now I can ban some books so you never see the side of how bad racism is. So you don't think racism is a big issue. I mean, that's what we're doing in Texas right now. They're banning books like To Kill a Mockingbird because they don't want to show the conflict of race and the horrors of that. It's too much for kids, they say. And you can do and we're banning a lot of books now, and that's one way to shape the minds and have you think a certain way. In history class like this one, I can teach you certain things that the state says is important. I don't have time to teach you everything, so you get one perspective, one view. It almost sounds like brainwashing, and it kind of is. Everything is going to be wanting to think of it. Everybody in every place has a motive and wants you to think a certain way. So this is just the best way, the most efficient way to do it, especially to children, is to sit them in school and you can assimilate them into American culture. 1 year in STAAR test, they actually showed this with Native Americans. And this was documented, this did happen. Native American children were captured or bought or taken from reservations, brought back to the East by these organizations who thought they were doing good, and they were put in schools. And 1 year, they had this on STAAR test. They had a picture of a Native American boy in his Native American ensemble. And then it said 1 year later, and a picture of him, haircut, wearing a suit, in his uniform for school. And it's asked, what example do you see here? And it was Americanization. So schools are actually the main point in doing that. It's most efficient way for society to make you more Americanized. And every country would do the same thing to assimilate to their ideas. Nativism is something we talked about before, but nativism was an attitude where fear of foreigners, you don't like people coming over, you thought you were native, even though in America the only true natives were Native Americans. But people from Britain that have been here for a couple of centuries, or their parents and their parents have been here, they saw themselves as natives and didn't like these new people coming and go over. We see this now in Latin America. You see people that are Hispanic and they maybe been here for, maybe they weren't born here, but they lived their whole life here, and they don't like any immigrants coming over now because they feel like these new people shouldn't be coming over. The idea of nativism exists all throughout US history. Last semester in History 1301, we talked a lot about how it was with the Irish. But now, the new immigrants from South and Eastern Europe, and the first nativist law that's passed is the Chinese Exclusion Act. The first immigrant law in the United States, almost 100 years after its foundings, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said Chinese people no longer, targeted Chinese people from coming over to America. And to show you how ridiculous this was for people in California. They were the ones having the time it was Chinese immigration, and they were arguing that they were in the economy, they're taking all the jobs, stuff like that. Basic immigration arguments, nothing new. But each state only has 2 senators and a handful of House of Representatives. So for this law to get passed, senators across 51% of congressmen in both houses had to agree to pass this to go to the president to get signed. But it was just California somehow was able to convince all of America that these Chinese were a problem. And when we look at stuff like drug laws and things like that, this idea that these guys are coming over, they're gonna bring opium, if you guys remember opium wars, it was always said that they're gonna give opium to women and take our women, things like that. They're horrible people, we gotta keep them from coming out, we gotta draw a line somewhere, it's always a famous phrase. And the Chinese were the first ones to suffer from that. It's pretty interesting when we look at that, how the whole nation was able to agree on this nativist idea, so much to pass a law for one state. I mean, it applied to the whole country, don't get me wrong, but it's just really one state that wanted it. But to appease the nativists across the country, they voted yes on this. As a matter of fact, to show you how crazy it was, from what I remember correctly, the president vetoes this. So it goes back to the Senate, where you need 2/3 majority to override the president's veto, and they got the 2/3. That's how many senators pushed this through, just to show you how crazy it is. I love this cartoon over here. Take a look. This cartoonist, he clearly has an opinion about this Chinese Exclusion Act. There's a Chinese person sitting outside. It says Golden Gate of Liberty. It's got American flags, so you know they're talking about getting to America. Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, this is a reference to that. The only one barred out is this Chinese gentleman here. Even though he brings industry, order, peace, sobriety, that was a play on those stereotypes about opium. And the American statesman, politician would say, we must draw a line somewhere, you know. On this side, it says, notice, communists, socialists, hoodlums, you're all welcome, but not the Chinaman. The one that brings all the good is not allowed. Clearly, that artist had a opinion about the China Exclusion Act and its hypocrisy in it. So it's pretty interesting. You do make sure you understand these 3 things. China Exclusion Act, assimilate, and Americanize. Those are very common. I do have this map up here, or this graph up here. I just think it's interesting when we look at this to see the 1920. This is a few years in the future, but this is the best I could do. Germany was the #1 immigrant in America. Born immigrants, foreign-born population in America. And it actually makes sense. Right before World War I broke out, 1914, America was really worried. American government was really worried that Americans would be pro-German because there's so many immigrants over here. Other immigrants, by #2, have Italy, Southern Europe, Russia, Eastern Europe, Poland, Eastern Europe. These were the new immigrants that faced a lot of targets that started coming over. Of course, we have Great Britain, Canada. When we look at the paperwork, people coming from Canada were considered Canadian. But if you had come over to Canada, or from Europe to Canada, and then Canada to America, you may have been classified under Canada because Canada didn't have that many people. I suspect this. I think it's funny though that Mr. Canada here has a Santa hat on or something. I don't know, whatever. But if you look at this, I always point out to my students, like, hey, look at Latin America immigration. 100 years ago, the only Latin American immigration here at all is in Mexico. That's it. So things do change. The first law regarding any Latin America immigration at all that I can think of is the 1930s. And other than that, the actual first real law comes into place in the 60s. So it's pretty interesting 100 years ago how different things were and how things will be different in 50 or 100 years from now. All right, the Klondike Gold Rush, just like any gold rush, Klondike is in Alaska. If you think the Klondike bar with the polar bear on it, you should always remember that's in Alaska. One year, that was a question. They wanted to know what was located in Alaska, and it was a Klondike Gold Rush. It was the dumbest trivial question ever. Because the main point of this gold rush is for you to understand what happens in gold rushes. Thousands of people set off for Alaska when they hear about this gold, and that's an example of migration. It's important for Alaska because as thousands of people finally get to Alaska, they stay there. Even if there's no gold, even if the gold is gone, even if it's all done with it, they stay there, and now Alaska can become a state. It was already a territory. We already bought it. Seward's Folly, it was nicknamed for the Secretary of State who bought it. People looked at it and he joked and said, Seward's icebox. It's just an icebox, why buy it? And then we discovered gold there. Because it's a whole migration pattern, gets a population in the area, and so then it can actually become an official state. Without Klondike Gold Rush, I don't know if it ever would have become a state. So on the STAAR test, this could be something simple as where is it located, Alaska, but it could also ask about migration patterns. You know, what does that gold rush, what does it contribute to? It really does start a massive search for silver and gold elsewhere. In the Rockies, silver is going to be discovered here. And a lot of these Native Americans that are in Great Plains or near the Rockies are going to be pushed off as well. So it does have an effect farther than just that. Indian wars, we don't talk about anymore on the TEKS. They're not there anymore. Part of it, I do think it's political. And the state of Texas, where we're at, there is this idea to try to not talk about the worst stuff in history, but there's quite a bit, Little Bighorn, Battle of the Wounded Knee, Custer's Last Stand. This stuff is it's interesting, but it does show the savage ideas of the U.S. Army in this. But it's not a STAAR test, so we won't get into it. It's something you should look up on your own when you're really interested in history beyond the high school level that you're allowed to talk about, in Texas at least. Now, railroads become really important. They're going to move people to this area, but it's not just a way to the west, it's also how it's used by like the U.S. Army. This is documented proof that we have this, but the Army was told to go to these areas, and we see a herd of buffalo, stop the train, get out, kill the entire herd of buffalo. Now you're thinking, why would they do this? Well, buffalo were the #1 food source for Native Americans, especially Great Plains Indians. They use a whole part of buffalo. From glue from hooves to certain organs you can dry and use as bags to carry it, to the hides that they would use for teepees. I remember because Great Plains Indians moved with the buffalo, they're hunters. They chased the buffalo in herds, so if they were needed low on food and herd went around, they moved with the herd, they packed up, and they needed the hide to make their teepees, right? Because they were portable. So that was important. If you look at this picture over here, you'll see these are stacks and stacks of hide. So we're always taught, even when I was a kid, that was one of the things that the U.S. Army did to try to force Native Americans away from the railroad and to help essentially eliminate Native Americans. But I would make the argument that capitalism itself may have done damage as well. Because back east, they didn't have rubber for the belts in all those factories. Rubber hadn't been created yet. What they actually had was hide. Leather belts were used. So when you think of it like that, you can easily see that maybe, just maybe, capitalism played a role too, as far as, excuse me, Native Americans being forced off that land. Maybe it just wasn't the U.S. Army. I do need to make sure you circle and know Homestead Act. This was passed during the Civil War. And any act passed during the Civil War was passed by the North, because the South was not showing up to Congress to vote. So the North was able to pass a lot of laws. One was the Homestead Act. And what they did was say any citizen of the United States, black or white, doesn't matter, as long as you're a citizen, you can apply, submit an application, pay for application fee. You'll be given 160 acres of land in the Great Plains. And in a few years, a government official can come by and check it out. And if you've improved that land, if you made improvement on that land, it's yours for free. And when I say improvement, I mean, boom, house, improved. Windmill, boom, improved. There was no like a huge checklist. It wasn't really strict. If you made that land better, it was yours for free, 160 acres. And many people did take advantage of this. I use this picture to remind you that, of course, is for any citizen, right? I'm coming back to that in a little bit. You have windmills here in the background. That's technology at the time. The house is made of a thing called sod, which I have another picture of. I do like to point out this postcard before I forget. It's hard to tell what this is, but these are actually skulls from buffalo that were killed. Because this didn't give a huge picture because it's all flat, but this might tell you differently. As you can see, this is a man here, and there's a man standing on top. That's how many skulls they had collected at one point from the buffalo they killed out in the Great Plains. Now, when settlers get out there after the army's gone through and cut out Native Americans, actually this is when the idea of reservations come up. When the railroads get through there and the army comes through, they have negotiations with the Indians and they say, hey, you guys stay away from railroads, stay to that area, and in this circle, we'll reserve that land for you and we won't mess with it. And eventually it becomes smaller. Eventually that area gets moved to the desert, crappy land, and it's called reservations. But the settlers that come in after that, after the army removes Native Americans, they live in these sod houses, S-O-D, sod. As you can see, it's made of dirt and grass, or dirt and hay. When you get to Great Plains as a settler, you get there, you want to build your home, it's the Great Plains. There is no wooded areas at all. So you have to be pretty creative. Some people brought wood once they knew to do that. Others, and you see this one is kind of more prepared because they actually have a wooden roof. But even on top of the roof, you have grass on top, right? You don't have any windows. I've read stories about how when people got there, they didn't have enough wood for the door. So they had to take apart their wagon that they came in just for the door. And you think, why, that's risky, how do you get anywhere? We don't have to get anywhere. You're in the middle of nowhere. There's no general store anywhere near you. Not for decades are you going to get railroads down to you or anything like that to create cities. You're really far out there on your own. And it is a big risk. Not everybody made it. What I started pointing out to my students today was like, hey, when you think about it, these are the ones that come out to Great Plains in the late 1800s. And maybe these kids grow up and they have kids and they inherit this land. But these 2 or 3 generations that go by, they're going to plant as much as they can, take it down, sell it, plant more, take it down. And they do this so much so fast with crop, they ruin the soil. And what happens to the soil is it becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. So like 30 years from now, in the 1930s, we have great winds in the Great Plains. And that's just the way it is because there's no trees there. So we have all these winds, always have. It's called Tornado Alley because of that. You get all these winds and it starts picking up all that loose dirt from the overproduction of crops. And in the 1930s, you have Dust Bowl. And these people may be adults or maybe their kids, or they grew up and had kids. And by the time that those kids were born, there was a Dust Bowl. And many people either died if you're young or left this area in the 1930s because of these people over farming in the area. But the Dust Bowl is farther on when we get into it, but it's interesting. Make sure you know these are sod houses, S-O-D, sod. That's a big thing for a STAAR test too. 1 year, sod just means dirt, that's all it means. Now, the cattle drive is another important part according to the state of Texas, because most of it is in Texas. But this is a transcontinental railroad, and if you were in Texas and you had land, what you could buy cheap and afford were this inbred cattle called longhorns. And those longhorns you would take on these trails, and these weren't roads, like these are man-made trails essentially, and you cut through people's ranches and every people's property, and you would take your cattle to these to parts of the Transcontinental Railroad, ship that cattle out to the Northeast, New England area, and they would pay good money for it, cut it up for meat. Longhorns weren't in the East, they had to be shipped there. Cattle up there in the east, most was actually milks and milk cattle, stuff like that, not inbred cheap cattle. I mean, even though the inbred cattle are not good for nothing, they were good for food. So you could take a handful of cowboys here and move hundreds of herds of cattle and get a pretty good payday once you got to these areas. Dangerous, very dangerous. There's a chance of stampede, and stampedes could happen from lighting a match, one cow getting spooked, lightning striking and one getting spooked, and even if you're in the front and those cattle start stampeding, they're going to take you down with your horse, and it's very dangerous. It starts really in Mexico with Mexican vaqueros. I tried. But it's pretty interesting. I have a clip here. If you can Google Open Range movie trailer, you'll see it's one of my favorite movies, but I'm an old guy from the country. And I really like those westerns. It's about the cow drive from one point of view. It makes you side with the cattle drive, what we call free grazers that take their cows all over. But the movie doesn't show this, and most Western movies don't. 1 in 5 cowboys on these cattle drives were actually African American, ex-slaves, or their parents were slaves. They found work doing this. And here where I'm at, we know black cowboys. It's not a crazy thing. But the movies really don't reflect that often, oddly enough. Now what really ends a cattle drive, 2 things you need to circle: barbed wire and railroads. Once barbed wire is created by some farmer who made a lot of money using his wife's loom to slide and twist the metal, barbed wire stops cattle in the tracks. It's also railroads, because you're thinking, oh, how do the railroads stop the cattle drive? And railroads were the reason for the cattle drive. Eventually, somebody gets a bright idea to move a branch off the railroad down to Fort Worth, Dallas area. And so now if you're in Texas, you don't have to drive your cattle all the way to there. You can drive them to Dallas, Fort Worth. That's why the greatest football team in America is called the Dallas Cowboys. That's why if you go to Fort Worth, you have these cow statues all around, because it's part of the cattle drive, essentially. So just make sure you know that. Get a chance to watch this movie trailer. It's a great movie, but I'm an old guy, I know. From this whole slide, I actually just need you to know one thing. That's the American Indian Citizenship Act. Now, as you can tell from the title, it gave citizenship to American Indians for the first time. Now, this is 1924. I've fast forwarded a good 30 years. Part of that is because when we do talk about 1920s, this doesn't really fit anywhere in it. 1920s is more about the economy and free market range, essentially. But so I got to put it somewhere. The picture of this guy right here that we think would be offensive because it's an old white man in a headdress. This is actually not offensive because this is President Coolidge. He signed this into place, this act into place, and when he went to visit reservations, they honored him for doing this. These people finally got citizenship, and it opened up a lot for them. Because when you do think about this, keep this in mind, the Homestead Act was for citizens, not Native Americans. They weren't citizens. Not until this point right here. What's also interesting is that before 1924, what could you do if you want to be a citizen and you're a Native American? Well, the government did have a solution for you. It was called the Dawes Act. And this was for Native Americans only. The government cut a deal. They went to a reservation and said, okay, you want to become citizens? This is what we do. We'll take your reservation land, we'll divide it up into 160 acres. Each family gets 160 acres. If you farm that land, we'll give you citizenship. Now this land is dry, it's desert. These people are hunters, not farmers by trade, by generations. So it's very unsuccessful. Now the government wasn't trying to be nice and give you a chance of being citizenship. They had one goal. So I tell the students, underline Dawes Act and make sure you know it's for Native Americans. But the one goal was to turn Native Americans into American farmers and Americanize them. So circle, underline, Americanize, make sure you know that was the point of this. Okay? So most students, the 2 things they get confused by this section is Homestead Act, which was for any citizen, good land in Great Plains, and the Dawes Act, which went to reservations and cut it up. They both were 160 acres, but that's not the key thing here. The key thing for Dawes Act is what's for Native Americans, and it was a tip to Americanize. Keep that in mind. A lot of times you see this as excerpts, and students don't know which one to choose. If you see anything about Native Americans, that's the Dawes Act, to make it short and simple. And that's the gist of this section. We got one more to cover. This other stuff that we talk about later in class, but for the purposes to make this video as short as possible, we'll cut it off there.